This is The Practicing Christian, and our report this week is entitled False Choices. We make them so often, but sometimes it's because we're choosing the cover of the book and not its content. We discover that later. Or an item says 22 carat, but is only gold-plated. Or it is indeed gold, but fashioned 2 years ago, not 500 years ago. Such instances as these are ones where someone else deceives us. But we must be careful. Sometimes we wish to be deceived and welcome someone who can promise us what we want, even if we, perhaps secretly, don't believe he can deliver it. Such as the $60 billion cost of weight loss programs in the United States alone. Yet average men's weights still increase by nearly half a pound a year. And sadly, many of us are pulled into orbits of those who actually believe what these TV actors are selling. One of these orbits pulls in religious commitments and also in political identity, almost everyone in North America. Like a planet with two moons, we're attracted by the twin orbits of the conservative and of the liberal. These two great identities circle endlessly, assaulting and insulting one another, and calling out truth as they see it, but which, in both cases, has frequent limitations to it. We can see these realities fairly easily. The political conservative, either a contemporary like Gary Will, or an early modern like Locke or Hobbes, generally agrees with the notion that we humans have a largely fixed human nature, are in possession of some natural rights, and should, as much as possible, be left alone. Progressives and liberals like Rousseau and Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, on the other hand, believe we have a malleable human nature. We're a blank slate, and we are ready to be written on and become new creations. Many plan far ahead. Some progressives see marriage structures as quite open-ended. For some, there can be different numbers of people, children, even the dead. Changes like these can be meant by progressives to be cultural or nationwide. As Rousseau wrote, the individual member alienates himself to the whole community together with all his rights. Now, that word alienate in Rousseau's time meant to recognize our dependency and willing attachment to others, totally, to the whole community, together with all our rights. Do you believe in a godless world in which we shall be able, as long as our technologies support it, to redesign people, families, work groups, perhaps even breed subhuman servants and factory workers? As one thinker in this movement wrote, where men can live in perfected, coordinated beehives. Guaranteed by what Randy Barrett of Georgetown University calls the judicial supervision of democracy. Or perhaps he really means judicial supremacy. Do you believe in a godless world organized rather splendidly, where social institutions, behaviors, and working conditions are protected from legislative encroachment? Mr. Will describes himself as an amiable, low-wattage atheist. He would agree that an outlook bereft of God lends itself to a conservative sensibility. Or do you perhaps believe in a God-created world in which our designer has set not only limits to what we may now accomplish, but also expansive horizons, a world which we may now begin to reach, filled with love, justice, and joy? Many who see this resurrection kingdom as a new Jerusalem, as in Revelation 3 and 21, which echoes Ezekiel, understand that it will be opened to those who have acknowledged their ties with God and are led by his Spirit. Well, in choosing between these three alternatives, please understand that what we casually call liberals and conservatives can be found in each of these categories. Our conservative, for example, our conservative President Nixon was in 1968 eager to establish a guaranteed annual income for all Americans, perhaps supported by a government-managed ownership for all individual adult citizens, equity ownership. And that's exactly what progressives are proposing today. The liberal Wilson, when he got to Washington, resegregated what had been integrated, every government building, toilets, water fountains, jobs, dining rooms, the whole ball of wax. A truth which many did not see for some time can suddenly become bracingly clear to us. God is always working both sides. His people are not only on one side, not on the, nor are the enemy's people always on the other. All God's people are called to serve our Lord Christ. Our common tragedy is that we frequently tend to be liberals or conservatives on a purely human basis. Having become so, we seek power to bring about change, which means uniting with all others who can help us win, alienating, in that old sense of the word, our powers to them, sometimes whether they have a godly view of life or a rather satanic one. Even apparently conservative Christian and liberal Christian churches and other associations can drift far away from their godly roots when there are powerful social and political urges to be met. Father Coughlin in the 1930s and Jim Jones in the 1970s are examples of this. Charity to the poor is common to all ancient societies. Roman and Chinese, Christian and Muslim, from grain doles for citizens who couldn't afford to buy food every month, to retirement homes, public clinics, paupers' graveyards and other needs of the poor, elderly orphans, widows, and disabled people have been helped. These good works grew as our needful human societies grew in wealth and power, with both private and public funding. All governments, those calling themselves Christian, as in Samoa and Russia, or those nearly secular, like Denmark or Japan, are still subject to the lordship of Christ and still frequently respond faithlessly. This means that the Church of God must always stand in the dangerous middle ground, where bullets fly and men die, making the hard, not the false, choices, the hard ones. For if we practicing Christians make false choices, we lead the shallower players to see and to adopt a partial truth. Tragedy can be the alternative. Great numbers of people have an alcohol problem. The temperance, really the abstinence movement, arrived from Europe on our shores with the first organized group starting in New York City in 1808. By 1919, its Christian leadership had been tempted and co-opted into using the power of the state to bring the Volstead Act and Prohibition by force of arms and imprisonment. After a crime and blood-ridden epic, the forces of good reemerged in the 12-step movement. God by another name, a higher power. No parades, no hatchets, smoky rooms and gallons of coffee, and a fearful honesty. Is that perfect godliness, kingdom life? Not quite, but it begins to get close. God was leading us before and since then. Many state governments believed that all men were born free and had inalienable rights. These men were often products of philosophy and natural law, not the Bible, God's law. Almost all enslaving nations, for example, Brazil and the French colonial empire, eventually used a compensation emancipation plan, with governments purchasing slaves' freedom with public funds. We Americans also did this, but only in the District of Columbia. Had we done it nationally, it would have cost us $1,365,000,1860 to free all American slaves. Our Civil War cost us $5,1860,000, and billions more, as well as untold misery ever since. We joined with our often secular, liberal, and conservative neighbors in building our social dynamics and running our public affairs. But not all are first and foremost servants of our Lord. They must beware of easily selected false choices instead of godly ways, when and if we can clearly discern them. Too many silly people believe that passing a law and funding it will solve whatever problem we're exercised about. Far more often, it's the hands-on working love of Christian men and women that redeems the evil day. At-risk boys won't be easily grown into godly men by school district programs. Practicing Christian men working through such groups as Boy Scouts, Trail Life USA, or Troops of St. George have a far better chance in helping them to get there. Serve then. Be the King's right arm.